In the blood-soaked chronicles of medieval Europe, no name echoes with more dread than Vlad the Impaler, a ruler so consumed by cruelty, his victims weren't just killed, they were sculpted into monuments of agony. He didn't conquer with armies, he conquered with terror. While other kings built castles, Vlad built forests of the dying entire landscapes, transformed into theaters of suffering where human bodies hung twitching on wooden stakes for days. Travelers spoke of roads lined with men, women, even children still alive, skewered from bottom to throat, their screams drifting for miles on the wind like a cursed hymn. This was not madness, it was method. A conscious decision to rule through horror so profound, even the mighty Ottoman Sultan conqueror of Constantinople turned back in fear. But what kind of man does this? Was Vlad a monster born? Or was he forged in fire shaped by betrayal, captivity, and the brutal politics of a dying kingdom? What drove a prince to turn execution into art, pain into politics, and fear into a language more powerful than diplomacy? This is not just a story of violence. It's a story of how one man weaponized the darkest corners of human nature and rewrote the rules of power itself. And what's even more terrifying, his methods worked. Welcome to the true story of Vlad Dracula, not the vampire of myth, but the real man whose cruelty was so calculated, so effective, that it still haunts the very idea of what it means to rule. If you think you know evil, think again. This is where horror was born. Before Vlad the Impaler ever touched a stake, he was a boy caught between empires, raised in a world where mercy meant death and survival demanded something darker than courage. To understand the monster, you have to understand the crucible that forged him. 15th century Eastern Europe was not a place for idealists. It was a pressure cooker of collapsing kingdoms, warring religions, and brutal power plays where alliances were bought with blood and broken overnight. And at the heart of it all was a tiny, fragile land called Wallachia, wedged like a lamb between two hungry wolves, the Ottoman Empire to the south and the Kingdom of Hungary to the north. Wallachia wasn't just a kingdom. It was a bargaining chip, a buffer zone, a battlefield. Its throne was less a seat of power than a death sentence on a pedestal. Vlad's father, Vlad II Dracul, knew this too well. He played the dangerous game of switching allegiances between Hungary and the Ottomans, trying to keep Wallachia independent while making enemies on all sides. In a desperate bid to buy peace, he handed over his own sons, Vlad and his younger brother Radu, as political hostages to the Ottomans. It was there in enemy territory that young Vlad first came face to face with the mechanics of fear. He didn't just witness executions, he studied them. He learned how the Ottomans ruled not with affection, but with precision terror. Rebellion wasn't met with debate. It was silenced with iron hooks and public mutilation. Vlad watched men die slowly, deliberately, to teach others a lesson. And from this he absorbed something crucial: people don't obey because they trust you. They obey because they fear what happens if they don't. Meanwhile, back home, betrayal carved its way into Vlad's bloodline. His father, after years of navigating a no-win political maze, was assassinated by Wallachian nobles. His older brother was tortured and buried alive by the very Hungarian forces his father once tried to appease. When Vlad was finally released and allowed to return to Wallachia, he came home not to a throne, but to a graveyard. His family was gone. His people were fractured. His nation was a pawn on someone else's chessboard. And what did that teach him? That compassion was a luxury and justice a lie. If you didn't rule with fear, you didn't rule at all. This is the soil in which Vlad's darkness took root. His brutality wasn't born in a vacuum. It was cultivated carefully through betrayal, humiliation, and survival instinct, sharpened by trauma. By the time he took the throne at just 17 years old, Vlad was not a boy looking to negotiate. He was a young man who had been raised to believe that pain was power and that mercy was suicide. Every scar he carried became a lesson, every betrayal a blueprint. And when he finally got his chance to rule, he didn't just seek justice, he redefined it. In a land soaked in treachery and dominated by predators, Vlad decided he would become the most terrifying creature of them all. Not because he was born cruel, but because cruelty was the only language his world had ever spoken to him. When Vlad finally returned to claim his throne in 1456, he wasn't stepping into power. He was stepping onto a battlefield without walls. Wallachia was bleeding. Civil war had torn the land apart. Foreign armies loomed on every border, and the local nobility, the same boyars who had murdered his father, still held the reins of influence. Most rulers would have approached this situation with caution, build alliances, offer pardons, negotiate peace. But Vlad didn't come back to beg for stability. He came back to remake the definition of authority itself. And he didn't do it with treaties. He did it with fear. His philosophy of power wasn't subtle, it was surgical. To him, mercy was weakness dressed up as virtue. Law meant nothing if it couldn't bite. And peace, was just the silence between screams. Vlad saw a kingdom that had devoured his bloodline and concluded that justice wasn't about fairness. It was about control. He didn't want to be respected. He wanted his name to tremble off the lips of his enemies before they ever dared cross him. So he went to work. He didn't just punish his father's killers, he turned their deaths into rituals. Impalement wasn't a crude execution method. To Vlad, it was a canvas. He redesigned it, refined it, made it slow. The stakes were deliberately blunt so they wouldn't pierce cleanly. They were inserted through the rectum or abdomen, angled carefully to avoid vital organs. The goal wasn't death. It was hours, sometimes days, of conscious, unrelenting agony. The result, human bodies hung like grotesque marionettes, twisting slowly in the breeze as living monuments to his rule. But this wasn't sadism for its own sake. It was psychological warfare at its most effective. Vlad understood something few rulers truly grasped. Reputation is power. You don't need to fight every rebellion if the mere rumor of your wrath ends them before they begin. Travelers who stumbled upon fields of impaled corpses didn't just scream, they told stories. Merchants who returned from Wallachia brought home more than goods, they brought legends. And those legends spread faster than any army could march. Even his supposed allies took notice. Foreign diplomats approached his court with trembling hands, unsure if they were guests or future decorations. Vlad's message was simple. Under my rule, there are no second chances. But perhaps the most striking part of Vlad's rise wasn't just the brutality, it was the logic behind it. Every punishment served a purpose. Every act of cruelty carried a message. He wasn't just cleansing his court of treachery, he was broadcasting dominance to the entire region. In an era where power usually wore a crown and carried a sword, Vlad wore terror like armor and wielded fear as his primary weapon. This was not chaos. This was control. And for a brief, horrifying moment in history, it worked. The boy who had once been a pawn in someone else's game had flipped the board, shattered the pieces, and declared, "From now on, I make the rules." Terror may have earned Vlad the throne, but it was escalation that carved his name into the flesh of history. He didn't stop at purging traitors or taming nobles. That was just the prologue. Once his grip on Wallachia was firm, Vlad didn't merely rule, he performed. And every performance was soaked in blood, precision, and unrelenting intent. His tyranny began to take on mythic proportions, not because it eased up, but because it became a spectacle so disturbing, so calculated, that fear became folklore. This is where brutality evolved into legacy. Take the Easter feast of 1459, one of the most infamous chapters in his reign. Vlad invited Wallachia's most powerful boyar families to a grand banquet. They came in silks with their wives and children, expecting reconciliation. What they got instead was a masterclass in theatrical vengeance. In the middle of the feast, as goblets clinked and music played, Vlad stood to give a toast, not of peace, but of judgment. At his signal, the doors were sealed, and the massacre began. The elders were executed on the spot, impaled as appetizers to the main event. The younger nobles and their families were marched in their fine clothes to the mountains, where they were forced to labor day and night, building the very castle that would house their ruler's reign of terror. Many died where they fell. Those who didn't were worked into the walls, their bones buried in the foundation of Castle Dracula, like a warning carved into stone. But it didn't stop there. Vlad turned executions into geography. Fields of the impaled stretched along trade routes. Victims weren't hidden, they were arranged, sometimes in rows, sometimes in spirals, always visible, always rotting. Merchants traveling through Wallachia wouldn't just report taxes, they'd return with stories of groaning forests and air so thick with decay that horses refused to walk forward. This wasn't just punishment, it was propaganda broadcast in the most visceral form imaginable. Foreign dignitaries wrote home in disbelief. One German merchant described the town square of Târgoviște transformed into a forest of the dying. A Hungarian diplomat recounted being invited to dinner, seated beside a window, facing dozens of freshly impaled victims, their blood steaming in the cold air. Vlad, ever the gracious host, asked if the smell bothered him. When the guest hesitated, Vlad smiled and offered to have him impaled higher, where the air might be fresher. It wasn't just a threat. It was a statement, no one is beyond reach. And that's when the stories shifted. Vlad was no longer just a ruler. He became a rumor, a warning, a ghost wrapped in skin drifting through the corridors of European diplomacy. His name began to travel faster than his soldiers. His tactics became cautionary tales whispered across borders, deterring invasions before they began. Even Sultan Mehmed II, conqueror of Constantinople, once turned his army back after encountering 20,000 impaled soldiers left as a grotesque greeting card on the edge of Wallachia. Vlad didn't just build power. He architected awe. And in doing so, he crossed the threshold from tyrant to legend, a man whose evil was so methodical, so undeniable, that even death couldn't erase his shadow. By 1462, the whispers had turned into roars. Vlad the Impaler's name was no longer confined to frightened peasants or trembling diplomats. It had reached the ears of the most powerful man in the region, Sultan Mehmed II, the very conqueror of Constantinople. Vlad had stopped sending tribute. He had mutilated Ottoman envoys. He had nailed turbans to skulls and lined the border with their bodies. It wasn't just provocation. It was a declaration: this land will bow to no empire. But what happens when the monster you've become stares down the jaws of a greater beast? The Sultan, a man not known for mercy, launched a full-scale invasion of Wallachia. Tens of thousands of elite Ottoman troops, seasoned by war and sharpened by conquest, marched toward Vlad's domain. To any sane ruler, this would have meant one thing: surrender, negotiation, retreat. But Vlad wasn't sane. He wasn't a general in the traditional sense. He was a psychological assassin, and this was his masterpiece. Vlad knew he couldn't win by force. His armies were smaller, his resources thin. So he weaponized the one thing he had more of than anyone else: terror. What followed wasn't just a military campaign. It was one of the most horrifying scorched earth tactics ever recorded. Villages along the Ottoman route were systematically emptied, not just burned, but repopulated with corpses. From a distance, they looked like quiet towns. Up close, they were open-air mausoleums, towns full of impaled men, women, even children, positioned as if they'd been frozen mid-conversation. Every step forward brought the invaders deeper into a nightmare where water wells were poisoned with human remains and granaries filled not with grain, but severed limbs arranged in grotesque patterns. And then came the field. As the Ottomans advanced toward Târgoviște, they found themselves face to face with Vlad's most infamous creation, a landscape littered with over 20,000 impaled soldiers, many still twitching, screaming, or oozing. The air was unbreathable. The scale was incomprehensible. Hardened soldiers vomited. Horses refused to move. Even Mehmed II, who had razed cities and seen untold carnage, was shaken. Witnesses claimed he turned back not out of military logic, but out of visceral human revulsion. And that was the point. Vlad's goal was never total victory, it was psychological collapse. He didn't need to win the war, he just needed the enemy to feel like they were already in hell. But Vlad wasn't finished. One night, under the cover of darkness, he launched a direct raid on the Sultan's personal tent. It wasn't a conventional attack, it was a message. Soldiers breached the Ottoman lines, set fires, slit throats, and came within striking distance of Mehmed himself. Though the Sultan escaped unharmed, the psychological impact was devastating. If the devil lived anywhere, it was here, and he had a name. Yet this level of brutality came with a cost. As Vlad doubled down on horror, his domestic support began to crack. Nobles who had once feared him now feared being near him. His own allies started to whisper not just tyrant, but liability. After all, there's a thin line between genius and madness, and Vlad had crossed it long ago. The same tactics that scared empires away were now isolating him politically. Still, in that moment in the year 1462, Vlad the Impaler stood alone as the man who made an empire bleed without ever needing to win. His war against the Ottomans wasn't measured in battles won, but in minds broken. He proved that the human psyche is the softest battlefield of all, and fear, when sharpened to a blade, can cut deeper than any sword. And as the Sultan's forces limped away from a land soaked in nightmares, the world saw something terrifying. Sometimes evil doesn't have to win. It just has to last. Terror built Vlad's empire. But in the end, it also tore it apart from the inside out. Because when you rule through fear alone, what you gain in obedience, you lose in loyalty. And as the dust of his war with the Ottomans began to settle, Vlad the Impaler found himself not surrounded by allies, but by silence. No cheering crowds, no loyal court, just the echo of a kingdom that feared him too deeply to ever love him. The cracks had started forming long before the final battle. His scorched earth campaign had worked militarily, at least. But politically, it was a suicide note in slow motion. Wallachia was now a landscape of corpses, rotting fields, and smoldering ruins. Trade had collapsed. Peasants lived in constant panic. Nobles had either been impaled, enslaved, or fled into exile. There was no one left to help him govern. No one to advise, no one to trust. Vlad had killed every voice in the room except his own, and now his silence was deafening. Even Hungary, his on-again, off-again ally, began to grow nervous. Reports of his atrocities delivered by stunned ambassadors and foreign merchants were no longer whispers in the shadows. They were headlines in royal courts. And while many European leaders initially admired his resistance against the Ottomans, they soon realized that this man wasn't a Christian hero. He was something else entirely. A sovereign who didn't just defy empires, but also defied civilization itself. King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, once a supporter, received first-hand testimony of Vlad's methods. Nobles flayed alive, diplomats mutilated, entire villages turned into death traps. For a while, Matthias had seen Vlad as a useful buffer between his kingdom and the Ottoman threat. But now Vlad had become a diplomatic toxin. Associating with him risked Hungary's standing in the Christian alliance against Islam. So when the opportunity came, the king acted swiftly. In late 1462, Vlad was captured not by enemies, but by those who once called him a friend. But here's the irony: they didn't imprison him for his crimes. They didn't chain him for his brutality. They locked him away because he had become politically inconvenient. His reign had become a liability, a stain too dark to ignore. Officially, his imprisonment was labeled protective custody. But the message couldn't have been clearer: you've gone too far. Even evil has its limits. Vlad spent 12 years in a Hungarian prison watching the world change without him. His absence allowed Wallachia to breathe again, however briefly. But even in chains, the legends of his cruelty kept spreading. Pamphlets printed in German cities detailed his methods with lurid fascination. Some of it was exaggerated, yes, but much of it was based on eyewitness accounts. The myth of Dracula had begun. And ironically, captivity only amplified his legend. When he finally returned to power in 476, the world had moved on. His enemies had adapted. His people had recoiled. His reputation still frightened, but it no longer paralyzed. Vlad tried to resurrect the old methods, the old fear, but they fell flat. He was no longer the ghost in the dark. He was just a man clinging to a weapon that no longer worked. And later that year, he died in battle, surrounded by enemies, abandoned by allies, and without a kingdom to call his own. His collapse was not explosive. It was corrosive, slow, inevitable, and quietly tragic. Because Vlad didn't just lose power. He lost the very thing he spent his life building control. And when your empire is built on fear, it only stands as long as people believe in the nightmare. The moment they stop trembling, it all falls apart. His throne rotted under him. His legend outlived him, and the monster he had become, it devoured him last. Vlad the Impaler died centuries ago, but his legacy never truly stayed buried. His bones may have rotted into dust, but the shadow he cast, the weaponization of fear as a system of power, still haunts us. Because the most terrifying thing about Vlad isn't what he did. It's that it worked. For nearly a decade, he held an unstable kingdom, together without gold, without allies, and without an army large enough to match his enemies. All he had was reputation, and he used it like a sword. But here's the uncomfortable truth: Vlad wasn't insane. He was disturbingly rational. He didn't kill at random. He killed with a purpose, a message, a warning. Every stake was placed with intent. Every corpse told a story. And in that story was a dangerous idea that cruelty, when done consistently and publicly, can become a substitute for law. You don't need to be just. You just need to be feared. That's the psychological core of Vlad's rule. He understood something chilling about human behavior, that fear travels faster than facts. People will act not based on what you've done to them, but what they think you might do. He created an entire nation that governed itself in his name, because no one wanted to find out if the stories were exaggerated. That's why his legend became viral long before the printing press turned his image into folklore. And centuries later, we still can't look away. But what does this mean for us? It's easy to write Vlad off as a monster from another era, a relic of medieval brutality. But then you remember that the world is still full of leaders who use terror as policy, who silence dissent not with debate, but with intimidation, who build their authority not on trust, but on trauma. You realize that Vlad wasn't the end of something. He was the beginning of a blueprint. And that blueprint has been studied by dictators, warlords, propagandists for generations. So what can we learn from a man who ruled with horror? The first lesson is this: fear is powerful, but it is also self-consuming. Vlad's control was absolute, but only as long as the fear remained fresh. Once the shock wore off, once the people stopped flinching at his name, he was finished. Power built solely on terror is like a fire. It burns bright and fast, but it cannot sustain. It devours everything, including the one who lit it. The second lesson: silence isn't loyalty. Vlad ruled over a population too afraid to speak, and in the end, no one spoke for him. When he fell, there were no last-minute allies, no uprising in his name, no legacy of devotion, only stories. Because fear can force people to obey, but it can't make them care. And when the fear fades, all that remains is the damage. And finally, the third lesson, perhaps the most haunting of all: evil doesn't always wear fangs or hiss in the shadows. Sometimes it speaks clearly, plans strategically, and looks just like us. Vlad didn't see himself as a villain. He saw himself as necessary. He believed that to bring order to chaos, you had to become worse than the chaos itself. That's the seduction of unchecked power. It convinces you that cruelty is not just useful, but virtuous. So the next time someone tells you that fear keeps people in line, remember Vlad. Remember what that fear cost. And ask yourself, is it better to be feared or respected? Because one builds obedience, the other builds legacy. In the end, Vlad didn't die as a hero or even as a villain. He died as a warning, one that still echoes every time power forgets its conscience. If this story made you question power morality or the terrifying depths of human nature, don't just scroll away. Drop a comment and tell us, do you think fear can ever truly build stability? Save this video to revisit the lessons hidden in history's darkest corners. And if you want more untold stories like this raw, haunting, and brutally honest, hit that subscribe button. Every legend we uncover starts with you.